and welcome to the Columbia Daily Tribune's Behind the Stripes webcast. This is Tribune sports editor Joe Walljasper alongside new David Morrison, our football beat writer. Dave, we are now through 2 preseason scrimmages, and I guess the biggest news to come out of Missouri football camp is James Franklin has officially been named the starting quarterback, but Gary Pinkel said he might get Maty Mauk a series or 2, maybe in games as he merits. So, your thoughts, A, on Franklin being named the starting quarterback, and B, what about the plan to possibly get Mauk a series per game?
Well, I mean, I think Franklin being named starter was pretty much a widely held assumption since the beginning of fall camp, really, and definitely since the end of the first scrimmage when he got all but 10 first-team reps. And I mean, I think it's the right decision, too, as far as what I've seen, outside of all of the stretching where you can't really tell a difference in the quarterbacks, even though one
Who's
might get
flexible?
one might get a deeper kind of stretch thing. But anyway, in the 2 scrimmages, Franklin has been the more efficient quarterback. He's looked the more confident in the pocket. I mean, there's a caveat in there, though, too, because Maty Mauk played mostly with the second team against the first-string defense, whereas Franklin was with the first team against the second-string defense, and you're not going to have as much of a chance to be successful, obviously, playing 2s versus 1s. But still, Franklin did look like the more comfortable, more accomplished quarterback back there. He looks at home in Josh Henson's offense, and I mean, ever since he kind of edged ahead in the spring, it seemed like his job to lose, and he didn't do anything to lose it. Mm-hmm. So I mean, I feel like it is the right choice. And as far as Mauk getting a series, I mean, I don't see many ways that it can be damaging. If he is indeed the quarterback of the future, which it seems like he's being positioned to be, then getting that game experience against SEC defenses can only help. Even if he struggles, at least he's seen game speed, and at least he's seen more things than just at practice every week. So, I mean, I feel like it can be a benefit for him.
Yeah, I believe it was kind of turned out to be a no-brainer that Franklin was going to be named the quarterback. I think it was the writing certainly was on the wall since the end of spring. Now, I think going into the spring, I would have had a different answer for you because I do think the coaches were very interested in seeing Maty Mauk, and probably were sort of hopeful that Maty Mauk would have been good enough to beat out James Franklin. Because although now you hear a lot of Gary Pinkel talking about how James Franklin really had all these injuries last year. Last year, the line of reasoning seemed to be a little different. There was a certain amount of frustration maybe that he wasn't playing with some of those injuries. So I think they would have hoped that Maty Mauk could have beaten him out. But in the spring, I think he pretty clearly did not. And that was during the spring was when they were getting about equal reps. And at that point, in those scrimmages in the spring, Franklin completes 61% of his passes and Mauk completes 48%. So I think at that point he has a pretty commanding lead. Then in the preseason, like you said, he certainly had the advantage because he was getting almost all the reps with the first team offense against the second team defense, whereas Mauk was often going with the second team offense against the first team defense, and that's pretty tough to overcome a deficit on the depth chart when that's the case. So, made sense, and I have no problem with him playing Maty Mauk in a game, except if it does seem like there's a pretty large discrepancy between Franklin and Mauk, and you're going to be in a lot of close games outside of the Murray State game probably, there is a certain amount of danger in throwing away a possession if you think there's a pretty big drop-off between the two. Mm-hmm. And I do think they're going to be in a lot of close games. Even something like a Toledo or Arkansas State game, there's no guarantee they're going to blow those teams out at home. They were both bowl teams last year. So there's a little bit of concern about that. Maybe the only other concern about that would be, is he really the quarterback of the future? Well, this might help you find out whether he is. But the other side is you may be giving a game to a guy who isn't even going to be your starter next year. I think there's some, and it's a good problem to have. I think Eddie Prince has impressed them, the true freshman, in preseason scrimmages, at least in the first 2. So he may end up being the guy, and so you could be spending some time getting your second man ready. Although that second man, if it's this year is anything like last year, will be playing plenty, even if you don't want him to be, because people do get injured. Mm-hmm. Moving on, we have now had a glimpse of Missouri's offense under new offensive coordinator Josh Henson. I know you weren't around last year to be a super expert on what David Yost did before, but just your thoughts on how what Henson is doing with the offense meshes with the talent that you see on this team.
Well, I mean, you can tell that his background is in tight ends in the line because, I mean, he really wants to use the tight ends in his offense in multiple ways. And I mean, the good news for him is at least it looks like he has the horses to do it. I mean, Sean Colkin has 6'6", 245, was almost a 1,000-yard receiver in high school, so he's big enough to block, and he's got the hands to catch. I mean, Eric Waters only caught 4 passes last year, but he looked pretty good going over the middle in the second scrimmage there, especially, when they've got the play-action fake going to kind of sock the safeties and the linebackers in. Waters can kind of run free, or Culkin, or whoever it is. The coaches have been impressed with Jason Reese, who's a true freshman tight end, another big athletic guy who can catch. So, I mean, Henson obviously wants to use his tight ends to create mismatches with the defense, with those linebackers that, might be too small to handle them in the block game, and then too slow to keep up with them in the pass game too. And I mean, he's got the personnel to do it, obviously, like I've said. So that's going to be an interesting thing to see how that kind of evolves in the offense this year, seeing as how I think tight ends only got 4 targets all of last season and last year's offense. I mean, I think that's kind of the biggest change we're going to see in the Henson offense this year is the tight end use.
Yeah, in the past, Missouri's tight ends were a huge part of the offense, but they were not maybe necessarily really tight ends. I mean, they were basically slot receivers, and there was always be an argument when it was time to vote for all Big 12 teams whether they really belonged. Chase Kaufman or Martin Rucker were really tight ends, or were they wide receivers? Although Chase Kaufman is now playing in the NFL as a tight end, so I guess maybe they could put that to rest. But they have used him a lot, except for last year. They certainly just didn't really have anybody that fit the bill, I didn't think. I mean, Waters was probably more of a blocking tight end who was sort of not at home out in the slot. So I guess the thing I like maybe a little better about what Henson is doing compared to Yost was I thought was a pretty good offensive coordinator. And last year was the first year they really struggled to move the ball. But I thought the one dangerous thing about him was when you're positioned so far to an extreme, which is kind of what they became, where it was just so often a 5 wide receiver set or an empty backfield. Okay, now where do you go when your personnel doesn't really match up with that? And it didn't really match up with that when you have an offensive line that's beaten down to nothing, and you have a quarterback, which was often their second-string quarterback, who was completely overwhelmed by the situation, and still you're trotting out 5 wide receivers, and you're not giving your line any help blocking. Well, it's nice that you have 5 guys running around the pattern, but there's no way Corbin Bergstresser can begin to read a defense and take advantage of whatever matchups you have when he's getting drilled after 0.8 seconds. So I thought they kind of painted themselves into an offensive corner where they couldn't adjust to what they had last year. So I think this year they probably will be a little better at that. They're going to have a back in the backfield basically every time. I mean, I don't think I've seen an empty backfield set the whole scrimmage time. So they'll have that. They'll have a tight end a lot of the time. So if they do need to give help to those tackles, they can. But I still think that the strength of this offense is going to be their wide receivers. If you had to say what is it that's good about this offense? Well, hopefully if you have a senior quarterback that's got some experience, he can help. But I think also you got really big wide receivers who are good athletes and have done it before. So those guys, when you're talking about Marcus Lucas, Damian Washington, Dorial Green Beckham, and you can even throw in Bud Sasser, who's been pretty impressive. Those guys are big, they're pretty good. So I think those are the guys that hopefully they can take advantage of. Then lastly, I think seems like we don't see a lot of the running game in these scrimmages. I think it's been very heavy on the pass so far, but in the spring, it seemed like their running game was maybe a little more quick hitting than it was in the past when it was pretty horizontal. So I was always an advocate of maybe a little more north and south running game. So I think that might be to their advantage also. Lastly, the question a lot of times people are interested in asking as you get closer to the season is which freshmen are going to play. Usually it's which true freshmen are going to play, but that list would be pretty short. So we're going to include redshirt freshmen in this list since not many true freshmen would be involved. So your thoughts, who do you think of the newcomers has a chance to contribute?
Well, there aren't that many on the 2 deep, actually. I mean, I mentioned Sean Culkin. He's going to be your starting tight end, and he's going to have a pretty big role in the offense. He's a redshirt freshman.
And he would have played last year. They were high on him last year, but he broke his hand.
Yeah, except for the injury, right. And then, John Gibson's kind of in the mix to be that third cornerback in the nickel and dime sets, with Ernest Payton and a bunch of other young guys. Harold Brantley's behind Lucas Vincent at defensive tackle, kind of trying to help make up for that Sheldon Richardson-sized hole they seem to have along the defensive front this year. Other than that, and Maty Mauk getting a series a game, you're probably not going to see many freshmen play this year. I mean, some of the true freshmen are making a push. I said Jason Reese earlier, but that's all going to depend on how many tight ends they want to use. Henson has said ideally he'd like to use 3, and you've got Culkin, Waters, and then he said Clayton Eckhart has kind of been the blocking back, all-purpose goal line set type. So I don't know if Reese can find his way into that rotation for this year. You got a guy like Josh Augusta at defensive tackle, which is another position where they need help right away, and he could be able to provide that. He's 6'4", 310, big, physical guy. And then
he's kind of intriguing.
Yeah, he
He's
was
a guy who played with the ball in his hand in high school, so I might believe. Yeah.
Right, and he was one of the top ranked recruits in this class too, and he was the one that they were kind of sweating and seeing. Well, I don't know if they're going to be able to clear him before he got here, or else he was going to have to go the Chase Abington route and the Antar Thompson route. But he's here, and so is Deron Singleton, who was even more. They were even more sweating him out because he wasn't here at the beginning of the camp. He missed 10 days of practice. But, he's a newcomer. He's not a freshman, but he should be able to help right away. Or actually, he has to help right away because he doesn't have any redshirt years left. So, if they can get him into playing mode, playing shape, and into the mental side of things, I think he could help in that secondary right away, too.
The only other name that might get a little bit of playing time, I would think, was maybe Levi Copeland as a receiver if you end up having to get some injuries there or run some guys out there. He's a guy that is probably going to be in the 2 deep amongst all those receiver spots. But it's a little problematic when you start trying to find freshmen who can play. I think ideally you would like to play maybe 4 or 5 true freshmen a year, and if you can't play them because you're so loaded with fantastic national championship talent, that's one thing, but if you're not and you can't play them because you had a bad recruiting year, which I think is more the case, then that's problematic. I thought they had they actually had a pretty good recruiting year the year before, and you had guys like Dorial Green Beckham and Evan Boehm who were kind of cornerstone players. But this year, not the case, so I think that's a little bit of a worry for Missouri, that there's not more, that this conversation is so short, it is ending our webcast a little before schedule, because that's something as you look, and obviously as we deal with the rest of this year, a big discussion is going to be about Gary Pinkel and his job, and one thing you look at is how bright is the future. So we'll see how some of these young players produce, because that's one factor in the mix. Well, join us again next week when we will preview that interesting Murray State visit and look ahead to the start of the season.